vibrant glow of string lights felt almost mocking as Mark stepped outside. His breaths were shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispered voices near the driveway confirmed his worst fears. Hidden in the shadows, he saw Anne leaning into Paul, Jake's cousin. Their movements were intimate, their whispers urgent. Then, the unthinkable happened. They kissed, their bodies pressed close as if the world beyond them didn't exist. Mark froze, his mind racing. How could she do this? The betrayal burned like acid in his chest. For a fleeting moment he considered turning away, burying the truth. But no, Jake deserved better. He deserved to know the truth, no matter the cost. Before we dive deeper into the twists and turns of this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. The warm glow of string lights draped over the backyard patio cast a soft, golden hue across the gathering. Laughter floated in the air, mingling with the faint clinking of glasses and the smoky scent of grilled steak. It was a quintessential suburban family dinner, the kind that should have felt comforting. But for Mark, it was just another reminder of how out of place he felt. Seated at the far end of the long wooden table, Mark nursed a half-empty glass of beer, his fingers tracing patterns on the condensation. Around him, his family buzzed with energy. His parents were locked in conversation with Jake, their eldest son, who sat at the center like a king at his throne. Anne, Jake's fiancée, rested a perfectly manicured hand on Jake's arm, her laughter melodic and effortless. Together, they looked like the picture-perfect couple. Her poised and glamorous, him exuding the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of being adored. Mark, by contrast, felt like a shadow in the bright light of Jake's world. His brother had always been the golden child, the pride of their parents, the one who could do no wrong. Jake had breezed through college, landed a high-paid corporate job, and now he was marrying Anne, a woman his mother often called the daughter she'd always dreamed of. Meanwhile, Mark had spent his 20s bouncing between odd jobs before settling into freelance writing. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a sense of purpose. Too bad no one else seemed to see it that way. "So, Mark," Jake's voice cut through the chatter, drawing the attention of the table. He leaned back in his chair, his grin sharp and teasing. "You're still writing those little articles, huh? Must be nice to work in pajamas all day." The table erupted in polite chuckles, though Mark noticed Anne's lips twitch into a smug smile. He forced a grin, raising his glass slightly in mock salute. Yeah, not everyone gets to marry a CEO and retire at 40. The tension between them was subtle, buried beneath the facade of sibling banter, but it was there, an undercurrent Mark couldn't shake. It had always been like this. Jake thrived in the spotlight, while Mark lived in its shadow. "Come on, Mark," his mother chimed in, her tone a mix of encouragement and exasperation. "Jake's just teasing, but maybe you could take some advice from him. He's done so well for himself. You could learn a thing or two." Mark's smile faltered, but he nodded anyway. "Sure, Mom. I'll get right on that." Well, as the conversation shifted back to wedding plans and Jake's latest promotion, Mark excused himself and slipped inside the house. The kitchen was quiet, a stark contrast to the lively scene outside. He grabbed a cigarette from his jacket pocket and lit it, watching the thin stream of smoke curl toward the ceiling. He hadn't smoked in months, but tonight the familiar burn was a comfort. Through the kitchen window, he could see the others laughing and toasting under the string lights. It was a beautiful scene, almost like something out of a magazine. But to Mark, it felt hollow. No matter how much he tried to fit in, he would always be the outlier, the one who didn't quite measure up. With a sigh, he stubbed out the cigarette and leaned against the counter, his mind swirling with frustration and resignation. This was his family, his reality, and as much as he wished things could be different, he knew better than to expect change. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that tonight would be the beginning of a storm that would upend all their lives. The perfect facade of Jake's life was about to crack, and Mark would be the one holding the truth that could either shatter or save them. The dinner carried on, the hum of conversation punctuated by bursts of laughter. Mark returned to his seat, the corners of his mouth fixed in a polite but tired smile. He sipped his beer in silence, letting the familiar rhythm of family chatter wash over him. Yet something felt off. Anne's laugh, usually bright and melodic, sounded strained tonight. It wasn't something anyone else seemed to notice, but to Mark, it stood out like a sour note in an otherwise well-rehearsed symphony. She leaned into Jake, her hand resting lightly on his, but her eyes flickered around the table as if searching for something or someone. Then it happened again. Anne's phone buzzed against the table, the faint vibration cutting through the ambient noise. She glanced at it, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Excuse me for a moment," she said, standing quickly and clutching her phone. Without waiting for a response, she stepped away, disappearing into the house. Mark's gaze followed her, his brow furrowing. It wasn't the first time she'd excused herself tonight. In fact, he realized, it was the third time in less than an hour. Each time she'd returned looking a little more distracted, her smile a little more forced. He tried to shake the thought, chalking it up to wedding stress. Planning a big day like theirs couldn't be easy, especially with Jake's demanding schedule. Still, something gnawed at the back of his mind. A shift in movement caught his attention. Across the table, Jake's cousin Paul leaned back in his chair, his phone in hand. His expression was calm, too calm, but his body language betrayed a subtle tension. When Anne returned a few minutes later, Paul's gaze met hers for a fleeting moment. It was quick, so quick that Mark almost doubted he'd seen it, but the look was unmistakable. Recognition, familiarity. Mark tried to brush it off, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. As the evening wore on, Anne's pattern repeated. Her phone buzzed. She excused herself. Each time, she returned more preoccupied, her polished facade slipping further. Paul, too, seemed restless, his eyes darting toward her whenever she moved. The undercurrent of something unspoken between them became impossible to ignore. Mark pushed his chair back, feigning a need for fresh air. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his gut told him there was more to this than met the eye. Stepping onto the porch, he lit another cigarette and let the cool night air calm his racing thoughts. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the stars through the haze of smoke. Then, movement near the driveway caught his eye. He squinted, his chest tightening as he recognized the silhouettes of Anne and Paul. They were standing close, too close, and their whispered conversation was just barely audible over the sound of crickets. He stayed rooted to the spot, unable to look away as they exchanged hushed words. Paul opened the door of his car and Anne slid inside. Without hesitation, Paul rounded the car and got in as well. A moment later, the engine purred to life and the car crept down the street, disappearing into the shadows. Mark's cigarette burned down to his fingers, the sting jolting him back to reality. He tossed it to the ground and crushed it underfoot, his mind spinning. 1,000 questions fought for space in his head, but one rose above the rest. What the hell is going on? He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Couldn't, without proof. But the pit in his stomach told him the truth was far worse than he was ready to admit. Something was deeply wrong and, for better or worse, he was about to find out just how far the cracks in Jake's perfect life went. For now, though, all he could do was return to the table, plaster on his best poker face, and wait for the next piece of the puzzle to reveal itself. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Mark barely noticed the chatter or the clinking of glasses as the family celebrated. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the moments he had witnessed, the glance, the whispers, the card. It didn't add up, but the unease in his gut told him to stay alert. Later, as the night wound down, Anne excused herself again. This time, Mark didn't hesitate. Rising quietly from his seat, he followed her at a distance, his heart pounding against his ribs. She slipped through the side gate, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Mark trailed her, careful to stay in the shadows. The backyard opened onto a quiet street lined with parked cars, their glossy surfaces reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. Anne stopped near a dark sedan, glancing around nervously. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Paul. They didn't say a word at first, Paul reached for her hand, pulling her close, and Anne didn't resist. Mark's breath caught in his throat as Paul leaned in, his hand brushing against her cheek. The two of them kissed, their movements hurried but intimate. The world around Mark seemed to freeze. His body tensed, every muscle locking in place as he tried to process what he was seeing. His mind raced. This can't be real. Anne? With Paul? He gripped the edge of a nearby fence post, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything, but his eyes stayed glued to the scene in front of him. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to act, to confront them. But his feet refused to move. Then Anne stepped back, her voice breaking the silence. "We can't keep doing this," she whispered, her tone urgent but conflicted. Paul ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in his posture. "You know how I feel about you. I can't just stop." Mark's heart thundered as their words confirmed what he already knew. It wasn't just a fleeting mistake. This was something deeper, something ongoing. "Don't." Suddenly, Anne's head snapped in Mark's direction. She must have heard the faint crunch of gravel under his foot. Her eyes widened in panic, and she whispered sharply to Paul, "Someone's there." Paul stiffened, but Mark didn't give them a chance to react. He stepped out of the shadows, his expression cold and unreadable. Anne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Mark," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what it looks like." He raised an eyebrow, the anger bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "Really? Because it looks like you're cheating on my brother." Anne stepped forward, her hands raised as if to placate him. "Please, let me explain. This was a mistake. It'll never happen again. Just don't tell Jake." Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "A mistake?" His voice was icy, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't make out in the dark with someone if it's a mistake." Paul, now standing behind Anne, spoke up, his tone defensive. "Look, man, you don't understand." Mark cut him off with a glare. "Don't even try," he snapped. His gaze returned to Anne. "Does Jake deserve this? Does he deserve to marry someone who's lying to him?" Anne's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. "I love Jake," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I do. It just happened. Please, Mark, don't ruin everything. Think about what this would do to him, to your family." Mark crossed his arms, his voice steady but dripping with contempt. "You've already done that, Anne. I'm not the one sneaking around in the dark." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Anne looked desperate, her hands trembling as she pleaded with him. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just let it go, for Jake's sake." Mark's chest rose and fell with deep, deliberate breaths. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave them there and let them deal with the mess they'd created. But he couldn't shake the image of Jake, the golden child, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding right under his nose. Finally, he spoke, his tone colder than before. "Jake deserves to know the truth. You don't get to decide that for him." Anne's face crumpled further, but Mark didn't wait for her response. He turned on his heel and walked back toward the house, his mind racing with the weight of what he had just uncovered. Behind him, he could hear Anne's muffled sobs and Paul's hushed reassurances, but he didn't stop. The night air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest as he approached the house. He knew this was only the beginning, that the truth he carried would explode like a bomb when revealed. And yet he also knew there was no turning back. The walk back to the house felt longer than it should have. Each step weighed heavy, as if Mark were dragging the burden of what he'd just seen behind him. His thoughts spun in endless loops, replaying the image of Anne and Paul, their whispered words, her desperate plea. He reached the edge of the patio but stopped short of rejoining the others. Instead, he leaned against the wall, staring out into the dark expanse of the backyard. The question gnawed at him. Should I tell Jake? Mark closed his eyes, his mind taking him back to their childhood. Jake had always been the star, the one who made their parents proud. He was the quarterback in high school, the honor roll student, the son who never seemed to falter. Mark, on the other hand, had always been the quieter one, the one who couldn't live up to the golden standard Jake set. Why can't you be more like your brother? Their mother's voice echoed in his memory. It wasn't said with malice, but the sting of those words had stayed with him for years. Mark had spent most of his life in Jake's shadow, trying, and failing, to carve out a place where he could stand on equal footing. He opened his eyes, shaking the thought away, but it lingered like a ghost. If he told Jake, would anyone even believe him? Anne could deny everything. She was polished, charming, and clever, everything Jake's family adored. And Mark? He was just the little brother, the one who never quite measured up. But then a new thought crept in. What kind of brother would he be if he stayed silent? Jake deserved better than this. No matter how complicated their relationship had been, Mark couldn't let him walk blindly into a life built on lies. His mind drifted to another memory, this one sharper, more recent. He remembered the night Jake defended him during a heated argument with their father. "Mark's doing the best he can," Jake had said, his voice firm. "He doesn't need to be like me to be successful." It was one of the few times Mark had felt truly seen by his brother. That moment of unexpected solidarity now weighed heavily on him. Jake deserved the truth, even if it hurt. But the fear crept back in. What if Jake thought this was jealousy? It wouldn't be the first time. Mark could already hear the accusations in his head. "You're just trying to stir up trouble. You've never liked Anne." He imagined Jake's face, the disappointment, the anger. Would this tear their family apart? Would it cost him the fragile relationship he'd spent years trying to build with his brother? Mark sighed and rubbed his temples, the tension mounting. The truth felt like a double-edged sword, capable of cutting in every direction. Yet, the image of Anne and Paul wouldn't leave him. It was a betrayal Jake didn't deserve, one that could destroy his life if he remained blind to it. Another memory surfaced, this time of their father's old advice. "You always do the right thing, even when it's hard." It was one of the few lessons their father had imparted that stuck. Mark clenched his fists, letting the words anchor him. He exhaled slowly and straightened his posture. The decision crystallized in his mind, sharp and unyielding. He would tell Jake, not because it was easy, but because it was the right thing to do. The fallout, whatever it might be, was something he would have to face. As Mark stepped back toward the patio, the lively sounds of the family gathering hit him like a wave. The contrast between their joy and the storm brewing inside him felt almost unbearable. He paused at the door, stealing a final moment to steady himself before stepping back into the light. This was his choice, and he knew it would change everything. The next morning, Mark sat across from Jake at a small diner just off Main Street. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but Mark's appetite had vanished. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, gripping the edge of his mug as he tried to find the right words. Finally, he took a deep breath and spoke. "Jake, I need to tell you something. It's about Anne." Jake raised an eyebrow, his fork pausing mid-air. "What about her?" Mark's stomach twisted. He looked down at the table, then back up at his brother. "Last night, I saw her with Paul. They're having an affair." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jake's fork clattered onto his plate and his expression darkened. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, his voice sharp. Mark braced himself. "I saw them together, Jake. She kissed him. They were in his car." Jake leaned back in his chair, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Do you even hear yourself right now? Anne? With Paul? That's ridiculous." "It's not," Mark said firmly. "I saw it with my own eyes. I'm telling you because you deserve to know the truth." Jake's fist clenched on the table, his voice rising. "The truth? Or is this just another one of your stunts to tear me down? You've always hated that I'm happy, haven't you?" Mark recoiled as if he'd been slapped. "What? That's not true. I wouldn't make this up." But Jake wasn't listening. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're unbelievable, Mark. Do you know how crazy you sound right now?" Before Mark could respond, Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Anne. Within moments, she answered, her voice faint but clear enough for Mark to hear. "Hey, what's going on?" Mark just told me some bullshit story about you and Paul, Jake said, his tone cold and accusatory. Is there something you want to tell me? There was a pause, and then Anne's voice cracked with emotion. What? Oh my God, Jake, I can't believe he would say something like that. Jake's glare bore into Mark. Well, what do you have to say for yourself? Mark felt his throat tighten as Anne continued, her voice growing more frantic. Jake, I don't know why he's doing this. Maybe he's jealous. Maybe he hates that we're happy, but I would never do something like that. You know me. Tears filled her voice, and Mark could hear her begin to cry. I can't believe he's trying to ruin this for us, after everything we've done for him. Jake's expression hardened as Anne's words sank in. He hung up and turned back to Mark, his face a storm of fury. You're pathetic, he spat. You just can't stand to see me happy, can you? Mark's mouth went dry. You think I'd lie about this? For what? What would I possibly gain from this, Jake? Jake stepped closer, towering over him. I don't know. Attention? Or maybe you just want to drag me down to your level. Either way, you've crossed a line. Mark stood, his voice rising in frustration. I'm trying to protect you. I saw her with Paul. If you'd just open your eyes. Enough, Jake roared, his voice echoing in the small diner. The other patrons turned to stare, their whispers filling the room. I don't want to hear another word. Mark felt his hands shaking as he watched Jake storm out, slamming the door behind him. He sank back into his chair, his mind racing. How did it come to this? The answer came later that day when his phone buzzed with a message from their mother. The text was brief but devastating. Jake told us everything. We're done with your lies, Mark. Don't bother coming around anymore. His heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. His family, his own blood, had turned against him. Not because of what he'd done, but because of the truth he dared to tell. Mark dropped the phone onto the table and buried his face in his hands. The betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined, not just from Jake, but from the people he'd spent his entire life trying to please. And yet, as painful as it was, a small part of him held firm. He knew what he'd seen. He knew the truth. No matter how much it hurt, he wouldn't let their doubt make him question himself. But for now, sitting alone in that empty apartment, the truth felt more like a curse than a gift. The days that followed were a blur of silence and emptiness. Mark packed his belongings into a few cardboard boxes, each item a painful reminder of a life that no longer felt like his. He left his childhood home behind and moved into a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of town. The space was sparse, barely furnished, and cold in its simplicity. Yet, it matched the way he felt inside. Hollow, abandoned, and adrift. The mornings were the hardest. Waking up to the gray light filtering through the blinds, he would lie in bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The weight of the betrayal, both his family's and Anne's, pressed down on him like a stone. The silence in the room was deafening, amplifying the thoughts that swirled in his mind. How did it come to this? He often wondered. He replayed the events over and over, dissecting every word, every decision. He had thought he was doing the right thing, standing up for the truth. But the fallout had left him utterly alone. His family had cut him off, and the ache of their rejection was sharper than he cared to admit. The few possessions he had unpacked seemed to mock him. A photo of his family at a barbecue, all smiles and togetherness, sat crooked on the shelf. The framed picture of him and Jake as kids, both grinning with scraped knees and dirt-streaked faces, felt like a relic from a lifetime ago. He considered throwing them out, but something stopped him, perhaps a faint flickering hope that things could one day be mended. Anger came next, surging through him in waves. It wasn't fair. He had done nothing wrong. He had tried to protect Jake, to save him from a life built on lies, and this was his reward. The injustice of it all burned inside him, but the anger had nowhere to go. It simmered quietly, a constant undercurrent beneath his sadness. At night, the loneliness was unbearable. The hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards were his only companions. He often found himself sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights in the distance. They seemed so far away, so unreachable, like the life he had once known. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The solitude that had once felt suffocating started to give him room to breathe. The silence, though still heavy, became a space for reflection rather than despair. He began to write again, not for money or approval but for himself. Late at night, hunched over the small desk by the window, he poured his thoughts onto the page. At first it was just fragments, disjointed sentences, flashes of memories, bursts of raw emotion. But over time the words began to take shape, forming stories that felt honest and real. The act of writing became a lifeline. With every page he filled, he felt a small piece of himself return. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He also found solace in small routines: morning coffee, a walk around the block, and afternoons spent at the library. These simple acts grounded him, giving structure to days that had once felt endless. The anger and sadness still lingered, but they no longer consumed him. Instead, they became fuel for something else: a determination to rebuild his life on his own terms. For the first time in years, he wasn't living in Jake's shadow or chasing his family's approval. He was just Mark, and that was enough. One evening, as he sat by the window watching the city lights, he realized he felt lighter. The loneliness hadn't disappeared, but it had softened. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer defined him. He wasn't healed, not completely, but he was beginning to see that healing was possible. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mark allowed himself a small, cautious smile. This new life was far from perfect, but it was his, and for now, that was enough. The day began like any other for Jake, his usual routine of coffee and emails occupying the morning. Anne had been distant lately, but he chalked it up to the stress of planning their wedding. She often said she had a lot on her mind, and he had always trusted her. But that trust was about to be shattered. Later that evening, Jake returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the faint hum of the dishwasher the only sound breaking the silence. Anne was on the couch, her back to him, phone in hand. She didn't notice him at first, and her posture was tense, rigid in a way that set off alarm bells in Jake's mind. Curious, he stepped closer. Her fingers flew across the screen, and she let out a soft laugh, a sound Jake hadn't heard in weeks. When she glanced over her shoulder and saw him standing there, her face paled. "Hey," she said, too quickly, locking her phone and setting it aside. "You're home early." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Who are you texting?" "No one," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just a friend from work." But Jake wasn't convinced. The way she fidgeted, the way her eyes avoided his, it didn't add up. Something was wrong. He reached for her phone, his voice firm. "Let me see." Anne grabbed the phone first, clutching it tightly. "Jake, don't. It's private." "Private?" he shot back, his temper rising. "What's so private you can't show your fiancée?" Her hesitation was all the confirmation he needed. With a sharp tug, he wrestled the phone from her grasp. She protested, but he ignored her, his heart pounding as he unlocked the screen. What he saw made his blood run cold. Text messages. Dozens of them. Paul's name appeared at the top of the thread, each message more incriminating than the last. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Do you think he suspects anything?" Jake's hands shook as he scrolled through the conversation, the words blurred, rage clouding his vision. He turned to Anne, his voice a low growl. "How long has this been going on?" Anne's eyes filled with tears, but her expression wasn't one of remorse, it was fear. "Jake, please, let me explain." "How long?" he demanded, his voice rising. She flinched but stood her ground. "A few months," she admitted, her tone defensive. "But it's not what you think." "Not what I think." Jake's laugh was bitter, hollow. "You've been sleeping with my cousin and it's not what I think? Are you hearing yourself?" Anne's tears spilled over, but her demeanor shifted. She crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "It's not my fault, Jake. You're never around. You're always working late, always distracted. What was I supposed to do?" Jake's jaw tightened, his fists clenched at his sides. "So this is my fault now? I wasn't neglecting you, I was building a life for us." Anne's defenses crumbled slightly, but she didn't back down. "I was lonely, Jake. And Paul, he was there." The mention of Paul's name ignited something in Jake, a fury he couldn't contain. He slammed the phone onto the coffee table, the screen cracking on impact. "You betrayed me," he hissed. "With him." Anne's tears turned into sobs, but Jake didn't care. He was done listening. His mind raced, piecing together all the moments that suddenly made sense. The late nights, the excuses, the distance between them. How had he been so blind? Then, like a thunderclap, another thought struck him. He froze, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Is Paul the father?" Anne's sobs faltered, her silence louder than any answer she could have given. Jake felt the ground shift beneath him, his worst fears confirmed. "Oh my God," he muttered, stepping back as if the truth itself could physically harm him. "You're carrying his child." "Jake," Anne pleaded, stepping toward him. "It's not like that. I love you." "I do." But Jake couldn't hear her anymore. His world had imploded, and all he could think about was how everything he thought was real had been a lie. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, the sound of Anne's cries fading behind him. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside. Jake leaned against his car, his breaths shallow and uneven. He stared at the darkened street, the weight of betrayal crushing him. The sight of Catherine Williamson sent him to rage. The realization burned like fire in his chest. The life he'd built, the woman he'd loved, the family he'd trusted. It was all gone, destroyed by the people he thought he knew best. A week after the confrontation with Anne, Jake sat slumped on Mark's worn-out couch, his face gaunt and shadowed by sleepless nights. The air in the small apartment was heavy with unspoken words. Mark stood by the window, arms crossed, his expression unreadable as he stared out at the street below. "I need your help," Jake finally said, his voice cracking. It was a stark contrast to the confident, larger-than-life persona Mark had grown up with. This Jake was broken, desperate. Mark didn't turn around. "Help," he said, his tone flat. "That's ironic coming from you." Jake leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I was wrong, okay? About everything. I should have believed you." Mark let out a bitter laugh, finally turning to face his brother. "Now you believe me? When it's convenient for you? When you need something from me?" Jake winced, but didn't argue. "Mark, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but Anne, she's trying to pin this on me. She's claiming the baby is mine, and I can't—" He paused, swallowing hard. "I can't afford to pay for a child that isn't mine." Mark raised an eyebrow. "And you think I can fix that for you?" Jake looked up, his eyes pleading. "If you testify, if you tell the court what you saw between her and Paul, it could prove she's lying. It's the only way." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on both of them. Mark shook his head, pacing the small room. "You're unbelievable. You didn't trust me then, and now you want me to stand up for you?" "I was wrong," Jake repeated, his voice trembling. "I know I hurt you, Mark. I know I let you down. But I don't have anyone else." Mark stopped, his jaw tightening. The anger he'd carried for weeks bubbled to the surface. "You don't have anyone else because you turned them all against me. You let Mom and Dad think I was jealous, a liar, when I was the only one telling the truth." Jake lowered his gaze, guilt etched across his face. "I know," he whispered, "and I'll never be able to make up for that. But I need you, Mark. I need my brother." The words struck a chord, but Mark quickly shoved the feeling aside. He had spent too long rebuilding himself, finding strength in his independence. The idea of stepping back into the mess that had nearly destroyed him was unbearable. Yet the sight of Jake, humbled and broken, pulled at something deep inside him. "Do you even hear yourself?" Mark said, his voice rising. "You need me now? But where were you when I needed you? You chose her lies over my truth. You all did. Jake's hands clenched into fists, not in anger but frustration. I can't change the past, Mark. I can only ask you to help me now. Not for me. Fine. But for the kid. He deserves the truth. Mark's heart twisted at the mention of the child. As much as he wanted to walk away, the thought of an innocent life caught in the crossfire was hard to ignore. He rubbed his temples, his mind racing. The silence stretched, the tension in the room almost suffocating. Finally, Mark exhaled deeply, shaking his head. I'll think about it, he muttered, his voice heavy with reluctance. Jake's shoulders sagged in relief, but Mark raised a hand to stop him. Don't get your hopes up, he said sharply. I'm not doing this for you. Jake nodded, the gratitude in his eyes tempered by the bitterness in Mark's tone. I understand. And thank you for even considering it. After Jake left, the apartment felt quieter than ever. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. He hated the position he was in, the impossible choice he had to make. Helping Jake meant reopening old wounds, but staying silent felt like turning his back on the truth he had fought so hard to stand by. The decision weighed heavily on him, but one thing was certain. Whatever choice he made, it would change everything. The living room was as familiar as ever, but it felt different now. The walls, once adorned with family photos and memories, seemed to close in on Mark as he stood near the doorway, his arms crossed. His parents and Jake sat on the couch, their faces etched with guilt and unease. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark took a deep breath, his expression calm but his voice carrying an edge. So, this is what it's come to. After weeks of silence, you're finally ready to talk. His mother, wringing her hands, was the first to speak. Mark, we were wrong about everything. We should have listened to you. Mark let the words hang in the air, his gaze unwavering. You should have listened when it mattered, he said quietly. But you didn't. You chose her lies over my truth. His father, normally a stoic figure, shifted uncomfortably. We thought, he began, but Mark cut him off with a raised hand. We came to terms. You thought I was jealous, Mark said, his tone sharp but steady. You thought I was trying to tear Jake down. Because that's the story you've always told yourself, isn't it? Jake is the golden child, and I'm the one who can't get his act together. Jake flinched at the words, but Mark wasn't done. He turned to his brother, his eyes narrowing. And you, Jake, you let them believe it. You stood there and let them paint me as the villain while you played the victim. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Mark held up a finger, silencing him. No, you don't get to talk yet. Do you have any idea what it was like for me? To tell the truth, to try and protect you, and to watch you side with her? His voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself. You betrayed me, Jake, not just as a brother, but as someone I thought I could trust. Jake lowered his gaze, his hands clasped tightly together. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I failed you. Mark's mother wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. Mark, we're sorry, truly. We made a mistake, and we see that now. Mark turned to her, his expression softening slightly, but not enough to hide the pain. Do you? He asked, his tone almost gentle. Do you see how much damage you caused? How your constant comparisons made me feel like I would never be enough? Like nothing I did mattered? His father tried again, his voice firm but apologetic. We were wrong. We know that now. But Mark, we're still your family. Mark let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Family? A family doesn't turn its back on one of its own. A family doesn't cast someone out because they dared to tell the truth. There was a long pause, the room filled with the weight of his words. Finally, Jake looked up, his face pale but resolute. You're right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I failed you, Mark. I let my pride, my blind trust in Anne cloud everything, and I'm sorry, for all of it. Mark studied his brother's face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but Jake looked earnest, broken in a way Mark had never seen before. His mother reached out, her voice pleading. Please, Mark, can we try to fix this, as a family? Mark let the silence stretch, his gaze moving between them. Finally he spoke, his tone calm but unyielding. I don't know if I can trust you again. You don't get to hurt me, then expect everything to go back to the way it was." His words lingered like a final blow. The family sat in stunned silence as Mark moved toward the door. He paused, glancing back one last time. "You made your choice back then, and now I'm making mine." With that, he walked out, leaving the house and the people in it behind. For the first time in years, he felt the weight begin to lift from his shoulders. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step toward freedom, and for now, that was enough. Mark sat alone in his apartment, the fading evening light casting long shadows on the walls. The events of the past few weeks played out in his mind like a slow, painful reel. His family's pleas, Jake's desperation, and the haunting echoes of their apologies, it all weighed heavily on him. Yet, despite their words, the wounds they had inflicted still felt raw, unhealed. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank page on his laptop. Writing had always been his way of processing, but tonight the words wouldn't come. Instead, his thoughts spiraled, circling the decision he had been avoiding for days, whether or not to testify on Jake's behalf. On the surface, it seemed simple. The truth was on his side. He had witnessed Anne and Paul's betrayal firsthand, but the deeper he dug into his feelings, the more complicated it became. Testifying wouldn't undo the damage that had already been done. It wouldn't repair the years of resentment or erase the betrayal he felt when his family had chosen Anne's lies over his truth. And it certainly wouldn't bring him peace. Mark let out a long, heavy sigh, his gaze drifting to the photo on his desk. It was an old one, taken when he and Jake were kids. They were grinning, arms slung around each other, the bond of brotherhood unshaken by the complications of adulthood. The memory brought a faint smile to his lips, but it quickly faded. Was that bond even worth salvaging? His mind shifted to Anne and Paul. The weight of their choices was bound to catch up with them sooner or later. People like them, selfish, deceitful, always unraveled under the pressure of their own lies. He didn't need to stand in a courtroom to expose them. They would destroy themselves without his help. The decision began to crystallize in his mind. He wouldn't testify, not because he wanted to punish Jake, but because he needed to move forward. Getting dragged into their mess again would only tether him to a past he was trying to leave behind. He wanted peace, and peace couldn't come from opening old wounds. As the thought settled, Mark felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The bitterness that had consumed him for weeks began to ebb, replaced by something quieter, liberation. For the first time, he realized that his worth wasn't tied to his family's approval or his role in their drama. He had spent so long trying to prove himself to them, to earn a respect they had never freely given, but he didn't need it anymore. Mark stood and walked to the window, the city lights blinking softly in the distance. He thought of Jake, of the apology his brother had offered, and he felt a twinge of sadness. He didn't hate him, not really, but forgiveness, if it came, would have to happen on his terms and in his own time. Jake would have to navigate the fallout of his choices, just as Mark had done. And Anne? Her and Paul's relationship was already showing cracks. He had heard through a mutual acquaintance that Paul was pulling away, reluctant to face the responsibility of their actions. Anne's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, leaving her exposed to the consequences she had tried so hard to avoid. It was only a matter of time before the life she had built on lies came crashing down. Mark turned away from the window, his reflection faint in the glass. He felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. This wasn't the closure he had envisioned, but it was enough. He didn't need to prove himself to anyone anymore. Walking away wasn't weakness, it was freedom. The next morning, he sent Jake a message. "I can't do it. I hope you understand." There was no response, and Mark didn't expect one. For the first time in years, he felt at peace with that. As he closed his laptop and stepped out into the cool morning air, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. His life was his own now, untangled from the chaos of the past, and for Mark, that was more than enough. Jake sat in the sterile courtroom, his hands clenched tightly around the edges of the table. The judge's voice was calm, emotionless, as the final decree was read, but Jake barely heard the words. The weight of it all bore down on him. His marriage, his trust, his family, everything had fallen apart. Anne wasn't even in the room. She had sent her lawyer in her place, a final act of indifference that cut deeper than he expected. When it was over, Jake stood in the hallway, staring at the folded copy of the divorce papers in his hand. The once pristine ring on his finger now felt like a shackle, and with a sharp motion he slipped it off and shoved it into his pocket. The hallway buzzed with the sounds of other cases, other lives unraveling, but Jake felt like the only person there. Back at his empty house, the silence was deafening. The walls, stripped of Anne's decorations and the warmth they had once held, seemed to mock him. The furniture was sparse now, reminders of her presence carefully removed. Even the air smelled different. Sterile, cold, unfamiliar. Jake wandered into the kitchen, opening the fridge only to find it nearly empty. A few bottles of water, some takeout containers. The effort of caring for himself had become a monumental task in the weeks leading up to the divorce. He grabbed a bottle and sank into a chair at the table, staring at the grooves in the wood as if they held answers he couldn't find. His thoughts drifted to Mark. The message his brother had sent weeks ago still lingered in his mind. "I can't do it. I hope you understand." At the time, it had stung more than he cared to admit. He had thought Mark's refusal to testify was an abandonment, another failure in their relationship. But now, sitting alone in the ruins of his own choices, he saw it differently. Mark had been right all along. He had been the only one willing to tell Jake the truth, even when it cost him everything. Jake's own pride and blind faith in Anne had led him to push his brother away, and now the consequences of that decision were unavoidable. Regret settled over him like a heavy blanket. He thought about the years of rivalry and the ways he had dismissed Mark's struggles, always assuming his own success was the benchmark for their family. He had taken Mark for granted, and now, when he needed someone the most, he realized how deeply he had failed his brother. The phone sat on the table in front of him, a silent challenge. For weeks, he had debated reaching out to Mark, but every time, the weight of his guilt stopped him. What could he possibly say? How could he ask for forgiveness after all he had done? But tonight felt different. The loneliness, the emptiness, it was unbearable. Jake picked up the phone, his fingers hovering over Mark's name. The words he wanted to say swirled in his mind, a jumbled mix of apology and desperation. He hesitated, then finally typed, "Mark, it's Jake. I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk?" He hit send before he could second-guess himself and set the phone down, exhaling shakily. The silence stretched, each passing minute amplifying his uncertainty. He didn't expect Mark to reply, not after everything, but a part of him clung to the hope that his brother would give him one more chance. As the night deepened, Jake sat in the dim light of the kitchen, his mind replaying every moment that had led him here. The mistakes, the lies, the betrayals, they were all clear now, sharper than ever. He had spent so much of his life focused on appearances, on winning, on being the person everyone admired. But now, stripped of all that, he saw how hollow it had been. He didn't know if Mark would answer. He didn't know if there was a path forward for their relationship. But for the first time, Jake felt the stirrings of something new, an understanding of what truly mattered, and a willingness to confront the parts of himself he had ignored for too long. The phone stayed silent, and Jake didn't move. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to sit with the discomfort, to face the loneliness without running from it. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that was all he could hope for. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Mark's new office, casting a warm glow on the stack of manuscripts scattered across his desk. The room was small but bright, filled with bookshelves, a well-worn leather chair, and a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for years. His career as a writer had taken off in ways he never anticipated. What once felt like an endless grind of freelance assignments had transformed into a fulfilling path, with his first novel climbing bestseller lists and readers reaching out to tell him how much his work resonated with them. Mark set his coffee mug down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the framed cover of his book on the wall. It wasn't just a symbol of professional success, it was a reminder of how far he had come. The story he had written, a tale about finding strength in vulnerability and truth, was deeply personal, though he doubted most readers realized it. In a way, putting those emotions onto the page had been his therapy, a way to process the chaos that had once consumed his life. His days were different now, filled with people who valued and respected him for who he was, not who they expected him to be. He had built a circle of friends who understood his quiet strength and his passion for storytelling. Their laughter filled his evenings, their support anchoring him in moments of doubt. It wasn't the family he had grown up with, but it was the family he had chosen, a family built on mutual respect and understanding. Still, the past lingered in small, unexpected ways. There were moments when he thought of Jake, of the bond they had shared as children, and a pang of sadness would surface. The memories of their childhood together were bittersweet now, tinged with the betrayal that had driven them apart. But Mark had learned to sit with those feelings without letting them define him. One evening, as he sorted through emails, his phone buzzed with a notification, a message from Jake. It had been weeks since Jake's plea for help, and Mark had assumed their relationship was over, left to quietly fade into the background of his new life. "Mark, it's Jake. I know I've hurt you, and I know I don't deserve it, but I just wanted to say I'm proud of you. If you ever want to talk, I'm here." Mark stared at the screen for a long moment, his emotions swirling. He appreciated the effort, the vulnerability in Jake's words, but he wasn't sure what to do with them. The wounds between them hadn't fully healed, and the trust that had been broken wasn't easily rebuilt. After a deep breath, Mark typed a reply. "Thank you, Jake. I'm glad you're taking time to reflect. I wish you the best." It was simple, direct, and honest. A boundary clearly drawn, yet not unkind. As he hit send, Mark felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance that their relationship might never return to what it had been. And that was okay. He didn't need Jake's validation anymore. His worth wasn't tied to his family's approval, and his happiness wasn't dependent on their reconciliation. He knew that Jake was happy, was hoping he could have Amber back. Jake was hoping he could have her back. Mark stood and walked to the balcony outside his apartment. The city stretched out before him, alive with possibility. The cool evening breeze brushed against his skin as he gazed at the horizon, his heart light and unburdened. He thought about the path he had taken, the struggles, the betrayals, and the lessons that had shaped him, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the freedom he had found in letting go. Life, he realized, wasn't about perfection or approval. It was about authenticity, about finding the courage to stand in your truth and build a life that reflected your values. And he had done that. He had carved out a space for himself, one filled with purpose, connection, and hope. As the city lights flickered in the distance, Mark allowed himself a small, contented smile. The journey had been painful, but it had led him here, to a new chapter, a brighter horizon. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. The screen fades to a montage of moments from Mark's journey, the vibrant laughter at the family gathering, the somber isolation in his apartment, and the quiet triumph of his newfound independence. Each frame tells a piece of the story, layered with meaning. The voiceover begins, steady and reflective. "Sometimes, the people we trust the most hurt us the deepest. The bonds we cherish, the relationships we build, they hold power over us, shaping who we are and how we see the world. But when those bonds break, when betrayal seeps into the cracks, it forces us to confront not just others' actions, but our own truths." The scene shifts to Mark standing on his balcony, looking out at the city lights. The weight of his experiences is etched into his posture, but so is his strength. The voiceover continues. "Betrayal, painful as it is, teaches us something invaluable. It shows us the importance of boundaries, of self-respect, and of the courage to let go. It reminds us that we cannot control others' choices, but we can choose how we respond to them." A flashback appears of Jake, sitting alone in his empty house, followed by Mark, surrounded by his friends, laughing over dinner. The contrast is striking, yet poignant. Family is more than blood. It's trust, honesty, and mutual respect. Sometimes, the hardest lesson is realizing that walking away from those who hurt us isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the act of choosing ourselves, of valuing our own worth, even when it's not easy. The final scene shows Mark sitting at his desk, pen in hand, writing in the glow of a single lamp. The page in front of him fills with words, his face calm, focused, and at peace. Through betrayal, we learn the value of truth, and through truth, we find freedom. The freedom to rebuild, to grow, and to embrace a life that reflects who we are, not who others expect us to be. As the music swells softly, the screen fades to black, the voiceover offering one final thought. Because in the end, the greatest strength isn't in holding on to what was, it's in letting go of what no longer serves us and stepping forward into what can be. The credits roll, leaving the audience with the quiet echo of hope and the strength found in Mark's journey.